They said she was broken. They said she wasn't worth the scraps she ate. In the freezing mud of Blackwood Creek, a cruel uncle put his own niece up for auction like a lame horse. The bids were insults until he stepped out of the shadows. Silas Kincaid, the man they called the Beast of the Bitterroots. He slammed a single silver dollar onto the barrel head. The town laughed. They thought he was buying a slave. But what happened up on that mountain didn't just silence the laughter, it exposed a conspiracy so dark it would burn the whole village to the ground. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the true brutal story of how a $1 purchase changed history. October 14th, 1874, Montana Territory. The mud in Blackwood Creek wasn't just dirt and water. It was a slurry of coal-dust horse manure and crushed dreams. It sucked at the boots of the men gathered outside the saloon of the Golden Steer. A ragged crowd of miners, drifters, and trappers who smelled of unwashed wool and cheap whiskey. In the center of the circle stood a crate, and on the crate stood Clara. She was 18, though she looked 12. Malnutrition had hollowed out her cheeks, leaving her large grey eyes to dominate a face smeared with soot. She wore a dress made of flour sacks that offered no protection against the biting autumn wind that whipped down from the Bitterroot Mountains. She shivered violently, her bare feet purple against the rough wood of the crate. Standing beside her, holding a length of rope tied loosely around her wrist, was her uncle Jebediah O'Malley. Jebediah was a man whose soul was as rotten as his teeth. He held a bottle of gin in one hand and the rope in the other. "Look at her," Jebediah bellowed, his voice slurring. "Stronger than she looks, eats next to nothing. Keep your house clean, mend your nets. Who'll start the biddin'?" The crowd murmured. It wasn't uncommon to trade labor in the territory, but this felt different. This felt like a slaughter. "She speaks," shouted a man from the back. Thomas Miller, the town blacksmith known for his heavy hand. "She don't talk much," Jebediah spat, kicking the crate. Clara flinched, but didn't make a sound. She hadn't spoken a word since the fire that killed her parents 3 years ago. "Quiet is a virtue in a woman, ain't it? Do I hear $5? Laughter rippled through the crowd. $5, Miller scoffed. "She looks like she'll die before the first snow. I'll give you 50 cents for the dress, you can keep the girl." The cruelty was casual, almost bored. Clara stared at the horizon, focusing on the jagged peak of Mount Moriah. If she looked at the mountain, she didn't have to look at the men. She didn't have to look at Mayor Cornelius Higgins, who was watching from the porch of the general store, cleaning his spectacles with a silk handkerchief, doing nothing to stop this. $2, cried a drunkard near the front. "I need someone to wash my pigs." $2.50, shouted another. Jebediah looked disappointed. He had owed a debt to the saloon owner, Big Mike, and $2 wouldn't cover the tab. "Come on, you louts. She's young. She's—" The crowd went silent. The hush started at the edge of the circle and swept inward like a cold wave. The men parted, scrambling to get out of the way. Walking through the mud was a mountain. Silas Kincaid was 6'4", with shoulders that strained the seams of his buffalo hide coat. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, disappearing into a thick, dark beard that was flecked with grey. He carried a heavy sharps rifle in the crook of his arm and a Bowie knife on his hip. The town called him the Beast. Rumors swirled that he had killed a man in Kansas with his bare hands, that he ate raw meat, that he worshipped pagan gods up in his cabin near the timberline. He came to town only twice a year for supplies, and he never spoke more than was necessary. Silas stopped in front of the crate. The air seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at Jebediah, his eyes dark and unreadable, like chunks of coal. Then he looked at Clara. For the first time, Clara looked down. She saw boots made of high-quality leather, caked in mud, but well cared for. She looked up terrified to meet the beast's eyes. But when she did, she didn't see the hunger she saw in the other men. She saw something else. Fatigue, or maybe recognition. "What's this, Jeb?" Silas's voice was a low rumble, like thunder in a canyon. Jebediah swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating. "Just settle in affairs, Kincaid. Selling off the burden. She's for sale." Silas looked at the rope around Clara's thin wrist. His jaw tightened. The scar on his face turned white. "She ain't livestock," Silas said. "She's my kin to do with as I please." Jebediah squeaked, though he took a step back. "Current bid is $250. Silas reached into his coat pocket. The movement made 3 men flinch, expecting a pistol. Instead, Silas pulled out a single, heavy coin. It was a Morgan silver dollar, fresh from the mint shining against the grey sky. He didn't hand it to Jebediah. He slammed it down on the barrel next to the crate. The sound was like a gunshot. $1, Silas said. The crowd broke into confused whispers. "That's less than the bid," Miller shouted. "That ain't how an auction works, mountain man." Silas turned his head slowly to look at Miller. He didn't raise his voice. He just stared until Miller looked away, shuffling his feet. $1, Silas repeated, looking back at Jebediah. "For the girl, and the rope." "But Miller offered," Jebediah stammered. Silas took a step forward. The floorboards of the walkway creaked. "Take the dollar, Jeb, before I decide to take the girl and leave the dollar." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a sentence. Jebediah snatched the coin with a trembling hand. "Sold. Sold to Kincaid." Silas didn't look at the crowd. He reached up with a massive hand. Clara flinched, closing her eyes, expecting a blow. Instead, she felt the rough calluses of his fingers gently undo the knot at her wrist. He tossed the rope into the mud. "Come on," he said. He didn't drag her. He turned and began walking back toward the mountain path. Clara stood frozen for a second. The crowd was jeering now. "Enjoy your prize beast. Don't break her in the first night." Mayor Higgins watched from the porch, his eyes narrowing. He whispered to the sheriff beside him, "Keep an eye on that. If she turns up dead, we finally have a reason to hang him and take that land." Clara looked at her uncle, who was already biting the coin to test its worth. She looked at the muddy street. Then she looked at the broad back of Silas Kincaid moving away. She took a step, then another. She had been sold for $1 to a monster. But as she followed him toward the tree line, she realized one thing. The monster was walking away from the village, and that was the only place she wanted to go. The climb was brutal. Blackwood Creek sat in the valley, but Silas's cabin was perched high in the alpine zone, where the air was thin and the trees grew twisted and gnarled. For the first hour, Silas didn't speak. He set a grueling pace. Clara, weakened by months of near starvation, struggled to keep up. Her bare feet bled on the sharp shale. She stumbled constantly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She waited for him to yell. Jebediah would have whipped her by now. But Silas just kept walking, seemingly indifferent to her struggle. "He's testing me," she thought. "He wants to see if I'm useful." As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow-dusted trail, Clara's legs finally gave out. She tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping her palms and knees. She lay there in the dirt, the cold seeping into her bones, waiting for the end. She couldn't get up. The crunch of boots stopped. Silence. Then the boots turned around and came back. Clara curled into a ball, shielding her head. "Stop that," the deep voice rumbled. She peeked through her arms. Silas was towering over her. He wasn't holding a stick. He was unbuttoning his massive buffalo coat. He shrugged the heavy garment off. Underneath, he wore a thick flannel shirt and suspenders. He dropped the coat over her. It was heavy, weighing almost as much as she did, but it was instantly shockingly warm. It smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and tobacco. "Put your arms in," he ordered. She fumbled to obey, her hands shaking. The sleeves hung a foot past her fingertips. "My boots," he said, pointing to his own feet. "Too big for you, but this will help." He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 thick pairs of wool socks. He knelt in the dirt, and gestured for her foot. Clara froze. A white man kneeling to a penniless girl. It was unheard of. Hesitantly, she extended a dirty, bleeding foot. Silas frowned at the cuts. He pulled a canteen from his hip, uncorked it, and poured water over her wounds to wash away the grit. The water was icy, but his hands were surprisingly gentle. He dried her feet with a rag and pulled the wool socks over them. "Can you walk?" he asked. Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Without a word, Silas turned his back to her and crouched. "Get on." Clara hesitated. "We lose the light in 20 minutes, he said, his tone flat. "Wolves come out in 30. Get on." She wrapped her arms around his neck. He hoisted her up, as if she weighed nothing, settling her onto his back. He grabbed his rifle and began to climb again. Resting her head against his shoulder, Clara felt the rhythmic thrum of his walking. He was solid, like the rock itself. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't shivering. "Why?" she whispered. It was the first sound she had made. Her voice was rusty, cracked like dry leaves. Silas didn't stop walking. He didn't turn his head. "Why what? Why the dollar? Why me?" Silas remained silent for a long time. The wind howled through the canyon, but Clara was cocooned in the buffalo coat. "I had a daughter once," Silas finally said. The words were so quiet, the wind almost stole them. "She would have been your age. Named Martha." "Where is she?" Clara whispered. "Buried," Silas said. The finality in his tone cut off further questions. "And I know a thing or two about being looked at like you're nothing but dirt. I wasn't buying a servant girl. I was buying a nuisance for Jebediah." "I am a nuisance." "To him, yes. To me," he paused, shifting her weight slightly. "To me, you're just a soul that needed out of the mud." They reached the cabin just as full dark descended. It wasn't the hovel the villagers described. It was a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked tightly against the weather. There was a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that promised heat. Silas set her down on the porch. He opened the heavy oak door and lit a kerosene lantern. The golden light revealed a single room, but it was clean. There were bookshelves lining one wall. Books in Blackwood Creek, only the mayor owned books. There was a cast-iron stove, a neatly made bunk, and a cot in the corner. "That's yours." He pointed to the cot. "I'll hang a blanket for privacy." He moved to the stove, stoking the embers and adding wood. Soon the room was warm. He heated a pot of stew venison and potatoes and placed a bowl in front of her on the rough-hewn table. Clara ate ravenously, forgetting her manners. Silas watched her nursing a cup of coffee. "What's your name?" he asked, though he likely knew. "Clara," she said, her voice stronger now. "Clara O'Malley?" "Well, Clara O'Malley," Silas said, leaning back. "You're safe here. Jebediah won't climb this high. He's got weak lungs and a weaker spirit." Clara looked around the cabin. On the wall above the fireplace hung a map. It wasn't a standard territory map. It was hand-drawn, filled with intricate lines and markings. She stared at it, her brow furrowing. "You like maps?" Silas asked. Clara stood up, walking slowly toward the fireplace. Her eyes traced the lines. She had a gift, one she kept hidden. She never forgot a shape, a number, or a line she had seen. "This is the valley," she murmured, tracing a line. "But this line here. The creek doesn't go that way anymore. It shifted after the flood of 71. Silas put his cup down slowly. He looked at her with a new intensity. "You know the land. I know what I see," she said. She pointed to a red X marked on a ridge near the town. "Why is this marked?" Silas stood up, his face hardening. The gentle savior was gone. The mountain man was back. "That," he said, "is where my wife and daughter died. And that is where your parents died, Clara." Clara spun around. "My parents died in a house fire." "That's what the town told you," Silas said darkly. "That's what Mayor Higgins put in the report. But houses don't burn down in the pouring rain, and men don't get shot in the back by accident." He walked over to a loose floorboard, pried it up, and pulled out a rusted metal lockbox. He placed it on the table. "I bought you for $1, Clara, because I saw your eyes," Silas said. "You have your father's eyes. Patrick O'Malley was my partner. We found something in these hills, something that got him killed and me branded a monster." He opened the box. Inside was a jagged piece of gold ore, the size of a fist, shimmering in the lantern light. "We found the mother lode," Silas whispered, "and the mayor knows it. He's been trying to drive me off this mountain for 10 years. He killed your folks to get their half of the map. But he didn't know Patrick hid it." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Hid it where?" Silas looked at her. "He didn't hide it in the ground. He hid it in the mind of a little girl who never forgets." Clara gasped, her hands flying to her temples. The memories locked away by trauma and silence began to crack open. The night of the fire, the men in long coats, the paper her father had forced her to look at, begging her to remember. "You're not worthless, Clara," Silas said, his voice fierce. "You're the key to the whole damn mountain, and tomorrow we start the war to take it back." The first snow of the season didn't fall. It attacked. It slammed into the bitter roots with the fury of a scorned god, burying the cabin in 4 feet of powder within 2 days. For Clara, this isolation should have been terrifying. Instead, for the first time in her life, it was liberating. Weeks bled into a month. The girl who had trembled on the crate in Blackwood Creek was vanishing, replaced by someone else. The transformation was slow, painful, and necessary. It started with the food. Silas was a skilled hunter. He brought in elk snowshoe hare and grouse. He cooked simply but heartily, forcing Clara to eat even when her shrunken stomach protested. The hollows in her cheeks began to fill. The purple bruises under her eyes faded. Her hair, once a matted mess of soot and grease, was now washed and brushed, shining like spun copper in the firelight. But the real change wasn't physical. It was in the silence. Silas Kincaid was not a man of many words. He didn't offer empty comforts. He offered tools. One morning, the air crisp enough to freeze breath in the throat, Silas threw a pair of heavy leather breeches and a flannel shirt onto her cot. "Dress," he grunted. "Dress warm." Clara obeyed. When she stepped out onto the porch, Silas was waiting with the Sharps rifle. It was nearly as tall as she was. "A woman alone is a victim," Silas said, staring out at the white expanse of the valley below. "A woman with a rifle is a fortress. Pick it up." Clara reached for the weapon. It was impossibly heavy. She struggled to lift the barrel. "Tuck it into your shoulder. Tight," Silas instructed, moving behind her. He didn't touch her inappropriately. His hands were clinical, adjusting her stance, correcting her grip. "If you don't hold it tight, the kick will break your collarbone. You treat it like it's part of your arm." He pointed to a dead pine tree about 50 yards away. "See the knot? That's Higgins's heart. Fire." Clara squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The stock slammed into her shoulder, knocking her backward into the snow. The bullet went wide, clipping a branch 20 feet to the left. She lay in the snow, gasping, tears of pain stinging her eyes. She expected him to laugh. She expected him to say she was useless. "Get up," Silas said. Again. She fired until her shoulder was bruised black and blue. She fired until her fingers were numb. And by the third week, she hit the knot. "Good." Silas nodded. It was the highest praise he offered. The evenings were spent on the map. The memory of the living map Silas had spoken of was still fragmented, locked behind the wall of trauma from the night of the fire. Silas would sit by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar, while Clara sat at the table with charcoal and parchment. "Close your eyes, Clara," Silas would say, his voice low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. "Go back to the study. It's raining. Your father is scared." He holds the paper up. "What do you see?" "Lines," Clara whispered. Her eyes squeezed shut, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. "Curved lines, like snakes." "Rivers," Silas corrected gently. "Topography. Look at the numbers, the coordinates." 42 north," she stammered, her hand moving across the paper, the charcoal scratching aggressively. 10 degrees west, the Devil's Throat." She gasped and opened her eyes. She had drawn a perfect representation of the canyon system 3 miles east of Blackwood Creek, but she had added something that wasn't on any official map. A narrow hidden pass marked with a symbol. 2 crossed pickaxes. Silas stood up and walked to the table. He looked at the drawing and his face went pale. "I knew it," he breathed. "Patrick didn't find a vein. He found the lost Dutchman's vein, the source." He looked at Clara, and for a moment the hardness in his eyes melted. He reached out his large hand, hovering near her face, before he pulled it back, resting it on the table instead. "You have a gift, Clara. A dangerous gift." "Is that why you saved me?" Clara asked, looking up at him. The firelight danced in her grey eyes. "Because I'm a map." Silas looked away, staring into the flames. The silence stretched heavy and thick. "At first," he admitted, his voice rough, "when I saw you on that crate, I saw Patrick's daughter. I saw the key to clearing my name. I thought business." He turned back to her. The intensity of his gaze made Clara's breath hitch. "But now, watching you fight the snow, watching you learn to shoot, you ain't just a map anymore, Clara. You're the only thing in this world that makes sense." The air between them charged with something unspoken, something fragile. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She stood up, reaching for his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, warmer than she expected. "I'm not leaving, Silas," she said firmly. "We take the mountain back, together." The moment was shattered by the sound of barking. Outside, Silas's 2 wolf dogs, which usually slept under the porch, were snarling. Silas instantly doused the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Down!" he hissed, pushing Clara to the floor. He moved to the window with the grace of a predator, the Sharp's rifle already in his hands. He peered through the crack in the shutters. 3 men, he whispered. "Tracking horses. They're wearing dusters." "Higgins?" Clara asked, her heart hammering against the floorboards. "Scouts," Silas confirmed. "He's looking for us, or looking to see if I'm dead yet." A voice called out from the darkness, echoing off the canyon walls. "Kincaid, we know you're in there. Mayor sends his regards. Says he's willing to buy the land back. $500. Silas didn't answer. He silently opened the door just a crack. "Stay here," he commanded Clara. "No," she said. She crawled to the corner and grabbed the Winchester repeating rifle he had shown her how to clean. "You go left. I watch the right." Silas looked at her in the dark. He could have argued. He could have told her to hide under the bed. But he didn't. He nodded. "Don't shoot unless they breach the porch." Silas slipped out the back. Clara waited her finger, trembling on the trigger. She heard snow crunching. A shadow moved past the window. A man stepped onto the porch. The floorboards creaked. He was holding a torch, preparing to throw it at the logs. Clara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She remembered the knot on the pine tree. She aimed through the window glass and fired. The glass shattered. The man screamed, clutching his shoulder, dropping the torch into the snow. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets chewed into the log walls. Clara racked the lever and fired again purely to suppress them. From the darkness of the trees, the boom of the Sharp's rifle thundered once. Then twice, silence. Clara lay on the floor, ears ringing. The door opened. Silas stepped in snow swirling around him. He looked at the shattered window, then at Clara, who was still holding the rifle aimed at the door. "You hit him," Silas said, sounding almost surprised. "He was going to burn us out," Clara said, her voice shaking, now that it was over. Silas walked over, took the rifle from her hands and pulled her up. He held her by the shoulders. "We can't stay here," he said grimly. "They know we're alive, and they know where we are. The snow is deep, but Higgins will send an army next time." "Where do we go?" Clara asked. Silas looked at the map she had drawn on the table. He traced the line to the hidden pass. "We have to go down," he said. "To the one place they won't look for us. We have to go into the devil's throat. But first we need the deed." The deed. The original claim. Patrick filed it, but he never recorded it in the county ledger because he didn't trust the mayor. He hid the physical paper. Where? Silas's eyes were dark. In the last place he was seen alive. The basement of the Golden Steer Saloon. Clara felt a chill that cut deeper than the wind. "We have to go back to Blackwood Creek. Tonight," Silas said, "while the storm covers our tracks." The descent was a nightmare. The blizzard had returned, masking their movement, but making every step a gamble against death. Silas led the horse, which was laden with their few supplies, while Clara walked in his tracks. They moved like ghosts, white shapes against a white world. They reached the outskirts of Blackwood Creek just before dawn. The town was asleep, buried under snow and silence. The Golden Steer Saloon sat at the end of the main street, a hulking 2-story structure of dark wood. They tethered the horse in a dense thicket of spruce a mile out. Silas checked his pistols. He handed Clara a smaller revolver, a Colt Navy. "Hide this in your coat," he whispered. "If we get separated, you run for the horse. You don't look back. You ride for the pass." "I'm not leaving you," Clara said. "Clara, I'm not," she insisted. She pulled her hat low. She was wearing Silas's spare clothes trousers, a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped around her face. From a distance, she looked like a small, slight boy. They approached the town from the rear, slipping between the livery stables and the outhouses. The smell of coal smoke hung low in the air. The back door of the saloon was locked. Silas produced a knife and worked the latch with practiced ease. It clicked, and they slipped inside. The saloon smelled of stale beer sawdust and sweat. It was empty, the chairs overturned on the tables. The only light came from the dying embers in the massive hearth. "The basement," Silas whispered, pointing to a heavy door behind the bar. They crept forward. The floorboards groaned. Every sound felt like a scream. Silas opened the basement door. It creaked loudly. They froze. Upstairs on the second floor, a bed spring squeaked. Footsteps thudded. "Quick!" Silas hissed. They descended into the darkness. Silas struck a match. The basement was filled with kegs of whiskey and crates of dry goods. "Patrick worked here for a month before the fire," Silas whispered. "He told me if anything happened, look for the devil's share." Clara scanned the room. Her eyes trained to notice details others missed swept over the barrels. "The devil's share," she murmured. She walked to the far wall. There was a row of whiskey barrels. Most were marked with XXX, or rye. But the one in the corner, covered in cobwebs, had a faint branding on the lid. A pitchfork. "There," she pointed. Silas moved the heavy barrel. It was surprisingly light, empty. He pried the lid off. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather satchel. Silas pulled it out and opened it. He pulled out a sheaf of papers. He held a match close. "The deed." He smiled a rare, terrifying grin. "And God Almighty." "What?" Clara asked. "It's not just the deed," Silas said, flipping through a small notebook included in the satchel. "It's a ledger. Patrick was keeping track of the shipments. Higgins wasn't just stealing land. He's been skimming gold from the federal shipments for years. This book hangs him." "We have to go," Clara said. "Now." "Well, well, well." The voice came from the top of the stairs. Silas spun around, blowing out the match, but it was too late. A lantern flared to life at the top of the stairs, flooding the basement with light. Standing there was Sheriff Barrett, a shotgun leveled at them. Behind him stood Jebediah Clara's uncle, looking more haggard than before, and Mayor Higgins himself wrapped in a fur coat that looked obscene on his rotund frame. "I told you the rat would come back for the cheese." Higgins sneered, adjusting his spectacles. "Uncle Jeb," Clara whispered. Jebediah squinted into the gloom. "That ain't the girl. That's a boy." Clara pulled the scarf down. "Hello, Uncle." Jebediah recoiled as if he'd seen a ghost. "You look healthy." Clara cut in her voice, steel. "Strong. Not the starving dog you kicked." "Enough," Higgins barked. "Barrett, kill the man. We'll take the girl. She knows where the entrance is. We can still use her." "No," Silas roared. He shoved Clara behind a stack of crates just as Barrett fired. Buckshot tore into the wood, sending splinters flying. Silas returned fire with his Colt, the boom deafening in the enclosed space. The lantern at the top of the stairs shattered, plunging them into semi-darkness again, lit only by the light filtering from the main floor. "Up the chute!" Silas yelled, grabbing Clara. He didn't head for the stairs. He dragged her toward the coal chute, a slanted wooden slide used to dump coal into the basement from the alleyway. "Climb!" Clara scrambled up the slick black wood. She clawed at the hatch at the top. It was latched from the outside. "It's stuck!" she screamed. Below, Silas was trading shots with the sheriff. He grunted in pain. "Silas! Push, Clara, push!" Clara braced her back against the chute walls and shoved upward with her legs, channeling every ounce of strength the mountain had given her. The latch groaned, the rusted metal giving way. The hatch flew open. She scrambled out into the snowy alleyway. She reached down. "Silas, take my hand." Silas was climbing, but he was moving slowly. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. Blood was soaking the sleeve of his coat. He reached up with his good hand. Clara grabbed his wrist. She pulled, her boots slipping in the icy mud. She wasn't strong enough to lift a 200-pound man. "Let go, Clara," Silas wheezed. "Run!" "Never," she screamed. "I bought you. You hear me? We're partners." She leveraged her body weight, throwing herself backward. Silas came flying out of the chute, landing heavily on top of her in the snow. They scrambled up. Inside the saloon, men were shouting. "They're in the alley. Cut them off." "The horse is too far." Silas groaned, clutching his arm. "We can't make it." Clara looked around frantically. They were trapped. The main street was to the right. The sheriff's deputies were circling left. Then she saw it. The livery stable across the alley. And parked outside, steaming in the cold air, was the mayor's personal carriage, an enclosed coach with 2 fresh horses, hitched and ready. "We don't need our horse," Clara said, a wild look in her eyes. "We take theirs." They sprinted for the carriage. Silas threw himself into the driver's seat, grabbing the reins with his one good hand. Clara jumped into the back, leaning out the window with her revolver. "Higher!" Silas cracked the whip. The fresh horses surged forward, just as the back door of the saloon burst open. Sheriff Barrett ran out, firing wildly. A bullet shattered the carriage window, showering Clara with glass. She fired back, not aiming to kill, but to scare. The shot sent the deputies diving for cover. The carriage careened onto the main street, the wheels skidding on the ice. They tore past the general store, past the spot where Clara had been sold. "Where are we going?" Clara shouted over the roar of the wind. "The bridge!" Silas yelled back. "It's the only way out!" But as they rounded the bend toward the bridge that spanned Blackwood Creek, Silas cursed. "Blockade!" A wagon had been overturned across the bridge. 3 men with rifles were waiting. It was a trap. They had anticipated Silas might run. "Hold on!" Silas roared. He didn't slow down. He steered the horses off the road. "Silas!" Clara screamed. The carriage bounced violently as it hit the embankment. They were heading straight for the frozen creek. The ice was thick, but was it thick enough for a carriage? They hit the ice with a bone-jarring crash. The carriage slewed sideways. The ice groaned, a terrifying cracking sound that echoed like thunder. Water sprayed up through fissures. The gunmen on the bridge fired down at them, but the angle was steep and the carriage was moving too fast. Silas whipped the horses, driving them relentlessly. They skated across the frozen surface, the wheels spinning and sliding. They passed under the bridge. "We made it!" Clara cried. Crack! The back wheel of the carriage punched through the ice. The vehicle lurched to a halt, tilting dangerously. Water began to flood the floorboards. "Cut the traces!" Silas yelled, jumping down onto the ice. He slashed the leather straps holding the horses to the sinking carriage. "Get on a horse, Clara. Now." Clara leaped from the tilting carriage onto the back of one of the liberated carriage horses. Silas struggled onto the other. As the carriage groaned and sank into the black water of the creek, taking the mare's fine velvet seats with it, Silas and Clara galloped up the far bank, disappearing into the tree line. They rode for an hour without stopping, deep into the labyrinth of the foothills. Finally, when the horses were blowing hard, Silas pulled up. He slid off his horse and collapsed into the snow. "Silas!" Clara vaulted off her horse. She turned him over. His face was grey. The bullet had taken him in the upper shoulder, but he had lost a lot of blood. "We got the book," he whispered, tapping his chest where the satchel was tucked. "We got him." "We have to stop the bleeding," Clara said, ripping a strip from her petticoat. She packed the wound her hands, steady despite her fear. "Clara," Silas murmured, his eyes losing focus. "The map. The pickaxes. I know," she said, pressing down on the wound. "I know where to go." "Not just to hide," he rasped. "The gold. It's not in the ground. It's in the water. The dam." He passed out. Clara looked around. They were miles from the cabin. It was freezing. The mare would be sending a posse at first light. She was alone with a dying man and 2 tired horses. She looked at Silas's unconscious face. He had saved her from the crate. Now she had to save him from the world. She managed to heave him over the saddle of the strongest horse. She tied him down so he wouldn't fall. "You hold on, Silas Kincaid," she whispered into the wind. "I didn't survive my uncle just to let you die on me." She grabbed the reins of his horse and mounted her own. She didn't head back to the cabin. That was the first place they would look. She turned the horses toward the jagged, forbidding peaks of the Devil's Throat, into the territory that even the Indians avoided, into the heart of the mine. She was the mountain man's partner now, and she was going to bring the mountain down on Cornelius Higgins's head. The Devil's Throat was a place where sound went to die. It was a narrow, twisting canyon where the sun only reached the bottom for an hour each day. The walls were sheer granite, slick with ice and moss. Clara led the horses deep into the fissure, following the map burned into her memory. The wind howled above them, but down here, the air was still and bitterly cold. They found the shelter. Patrick O'Malley had marked a shallow cave hidden behind a screen of weeping willows that had long since frozen into crystalline sculptures. It was a miner's test shaft, abandoned years ago. Clara dragged Silas inside. He was burning up with fever. The wound in his shoulder was angry and swollen. The bullet was still inside. "Silas," she said, shaking him. "Silas, I have to take it out." He opened his eyes. They were glassy. He looked at her, but he didn't seem to recognize her at first. Then a faint smile touched his lips. "The girl with the iron backbone," he whispered. "Do it." Clara had no whiskey to give him. She had no laudanum. She built a fire near the mouth of the cave to boil water and heat the blade of her knife. She tore the last of her petticoats into strips. "Bite on this," she said, handing him a thick leather strap from the saddlebag. Silas clamped his jaw around the leather. He nodded once. The next 10 minutes were a blur of blood and horror. Clara dug for the lead, her hands slick, her stomach churning. Silas didn't scream, but he made a guttural sound deep in his chest that tore at Clara's heart. His body bucked, his muscles seizing. Clink! The flattened lead bullet dropped into the tin cup. Clara quickly packed the wound with moss and bound it tight. Silas had passed out from the pain. She covered him with every blanket and coat they had, then curled up beside him, sharing her body heat. For 2 days the storm raged outside, sealing them in the canyon. For 2 days Silas hovered between life and death. Clara didn't sleep. She melted snow for him to drink. She cleaned his brow. She spoke to him, telling him stories of her childhood, stories of the parents she remembered, stories of the life they would have. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Clara woke to find Silas watching her. His color was better. The grey death mask was gone. "You stayed," he said, his voice raspy. "I told you," Clara said, sitting up and rubbing her stiff neck. "We're partners." Silas sat up slowly, wincing. He looked around the cave. Then he looked at the back wall of the shaft. "Clara," he said. "Look." Clara turned. The firelight was flickering against the rock face. Where the miners had stopped digging, there was a fissure, and trickling through that fissure was water. But it wasn't just water. Silas stood up, using the wall for support. He walked to the trickle and held his hand under it. He brought his hand back to the light. In his palm, amidst the grit and silt, lay 3 nuggets the size of corn kernels, rough, heavy, and unmistakably yellow. "It's not a vein," Silas realized, his eyes widening. Patrick was right. It's an alluvial deposit, an underground river pushing the gold right out of the mountain. He grabbed a pickaxe that had been left in the cave decades ago. He struck the rock wall. It crumbled easily. Behind it was a cavern, echoing with the sound of rushing water. They squeezed through the opening. They found themselves on a ledge overlooking a subterranean river that flowed through a massive volcanic tube. The sandy banks of the river glittered. It wasn't just specks. The banks were paved with gold dust and nuggets. It was a fortune beyond calculation. A king's ransom buried in the dark. "This is it," Silas whispered. "The mother lode." Clara looked at the gold. It was beautiful, yes. It was freedom. But then she looked at Silas. He wasn't looking at the gold with greed. He was looking at it with relief. "This clears my name," he said. "This proves Patrick wasn't a liar. It proves he didn't die for nothing." He turned to Clara. In the glow of the lantern, surrounded by millions of dollars in gold, he took her face in his hands. "Half tall," he said. "Half is yours. You're a rich woman, Clara O'Malley. You can go to San Francisco, Paris. You can buy the finest dresses and never touch mud again." Clara covered his hands with hers. "I don't want Paris. I don't want San Francisco. What do you want?" "I want the man who saw me when I was invisible," she said fiercely. "I want the man who spent his last dollar on a worthless girl." Silas looked at her, searching her eyes for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he lowered his forehead to hers. "You were never worthless," he breathed. "You were priceless." He kissed her then. It wasn't the kiss of a savage mountain man. It was desperate and tender, a seal on a bond forged in ice and blood. But the moment was broken by a sound that echoed down the ventilation shaft from the surface. A bugle. Silas pulled back, his eyes hardening. They found us. Higgins hadn't just brought a posse. He had brought a war. Peering out from the cave entrance hidden by the willow screen, Silas and Clara counted 20 men. They were spread out along the ridge of the canyon, searching the rocks. They had dogs. "He hired mercenaries," Silas noted, spotting the distinct long coats of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, or men pretending to be them. "That's expensive. He's desperate." "He knows we have the ledger," Clara said. "If we get to a federal judge, he hangs." We can't fight 20 men, Silas said, checking his ammunition. I have 6 rounds for the sharps. You have 12 for the pistol. We don't have to shoot them all. Clara said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the geography of the canyon. We just have to break them. She turned to Silas. The underground river. The pressure is immense, right? It's held back by a wall of shale and timber. If that breaks... Silas stopped. He looked at Clara with a mix of shock and admiration. You want to flood the canyon? They're in the basin, Clara pointed. If we blow the retention wall inside the cave, the water bursts out here. It sweeps the canyon floor. It'll wash the gold away, Silas warned. Some of it anyway. I don't care about the gold, Clara said. I care about living. Silas nodded. We need black powder. The miners, Clara said. They would have left charges. They scrambled back into the cave. They found a crate of blasting powder near the entrance, old and unstable sweating, nitroglycerin. It was incredibly dangerous to move. I'll set it, Silas said. You take the horses and get to the high ledge. There's a goat path. No, Clara said. We do it together. I light the fuse. You shoot the crate. There was no time to argue. The dogs were barking. A voice echoed from outside. We found the horses. They're in the cave. Bullets began to ping against the rock face. Silas and Clara moved the crate to the thin wall of rock, holding back the underground river. They inserted a short fuse. Go! Silas yelled. They sprinted for the narrow chimney, a vertical shaft that led up to a higher shelf of rock, 50 feet above the canyon floor. Silas boosted Clara up, then hauled himself after her, his bad shoulder screaming in protest. They reached the ledge just as Higgins's men swarmed the cave entrance below. Flush them out! Higgins screamed from the canyon floor. He was sitting on a horse safe behind the line of gunmen. Burn them out! Silas lay on the ledge, the sharp's rifle pressed to his shoulder. He aimed not at the men, but into the darkness of the cave mouth below where the crate of powder sat. Hey! Clara yelled from the ledge. The men below looked up. Higgins squinted, spotting them. There, kill them. Mayor Higgins! Clara's voice rang out clear and defiant. You wanted the O'Malley claim. You wanted the gold. Throw down the Ledger girl and I'll make it quick. Higgins laughed. You can have the gold, Clara shouted. All of it. She touched Silas's arm. Now. Silas pulled the trigger. The bullet flew true diving into the dark cave. For a second, there was silence. Then the mountain hiccuped. A dull whoomp shook the ground, followed by a cracking sound that split the air like a thunderclap. The explosion blew the mouth of the cave outward, showering the mercenaries in rock dust. But that was just the beginning. The retention wall shattered. The underground river, dammed up for centuries, was unleashed. With a roar that sounded like a dragon waking up a wall of water 10 feet high, exploded out of the cave. It was a torrent of freezing water mud and jagged quartz. Run! Higgins screamed, wheeling his horse. It was too late. The water slammed into the mercenaries. Men and horses were tossed like toys. The flood swept through the narrow canyon, scouring everything in its path. The gunmen who had been ready to kill were now fighting for breath, clinging to rocks being washed downstream toward the valley. Higgins's horse panicked and threw him. The mare scrambled up a boulder, soaking wet, his fur coat heavy and dragging him down. He watched in horror as his army was flushed away. On the high ledge, Silas and Clara watched the devastation. The water raged for 10 minutes, then slowed to a steady, violent creak. The floor of the canyon was altered. The snow was gone, replaced by mud and rock. And glittering in the mud exposed by the flood were thousands of streaks of yellow. Higgins, shivering on his rock, looked down. He saw the gold. He saw the fortune he had killed for lying in the open. He laughed a manic, broken sound. Gold! It's all gold! He scrambled down from the rock, falling into the mud. He began grabbing handfuls of the muck, stuffing it into his pockets. Mine! It's all mine! Mayor! Silas called out. Higgins looked up. Silas stood on the ledge, the rifle aimed at the mayor's chest. It's over, Cornelius! Silas boomed. Higgins sneered, clutching the gold. You can't shoot me, Kincaid. I'm the law. I own this town. Silas lowered the rifle. I ain't gonna shoot you. He pointed to the entrance of the canyon. Riding through the mud, picking their way carefully past the debris, were 4 men. They wore the stars of the U.S. Marshals Service. We sent the ledger to the governor 3 days ago via the post coach, Silas called down, before we even came back to the mine. These gentlemen have been waiting for you. Higgins dropped the gold. He fell to his knees in the mud, surrounded by the wealth he could never spend. Clara stood beside Silas, her hand in his. They watched as the marshals shackled the mare. The beast of the bitter roots, and the girl worth $1 had won. Spring, 1875. The snow had melted from the bitter roots, replaced by a carpet of wildflowers. Bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and arrowleaf balsam root. Blackwood Creek was different now. The Golden Steer Saloon was under new management. The sign out front had been repainted. It was clean. The mood in the town was lighter. The fear that had hung over the valley like a smog was gone. On the steps of the newly built town hall, a crowd had gathered. But this wasn't a crowd of angry, desperate men. It was a community. A carriage pulled up, not a stolen one, but a fine, open-top buggy. Silas Kincaid stepped down. He wore a suit tailored to fit his massive frame, though he still wore his beard trimmed and neat. He offered his hand to the woman inside. Clara stepped out. She wore a dress of deep emerald green silk that brought out the fire in her hair. She held her head high. She was no longer the emaciated ghost on the crate. She was beautiful, striking, and radiating a quiet power. They walked up the steps together. "Speech!" someone shouted. It was Thomas Miller, the blacksmith. He looked sheepish, holding his hat in his hands. Clara turned to face the crowd. She scanned the faces. She saw the men who had bid on her. She saw the people who had watched her suffer. She could have hated them. She could have bought the town and evicted them all. But Silas had taught her that hate was a heavy stone to carry up a mountain. 6 months ago. Clara began, her voice carrying clear and strong, without a tremor. I stood in the mud down there. I was worth $1. The crowd went silent. Today my husband and I... She glanced at Silas, who beamed with pride. Own the O'Malley Kincaid mine. It is the richest strike in the territory. But gold is cold comfort. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a piece of paper. This is the deed to the land surrounding the creek. The land where your homes are. The land Higgins stole from you with his debts and his lies. She held it up. Then she ripped it in half. Then in quarters. She threw the confetti into the wind. The debt is cleared, Clara announced. You own your homes. You own your lives. A gasp went through the crowd, followed by a roar of approval that shook the birds from the trees. Men were crying. Women were hugging their children. Clara turned to Silas. Did I do it right? Better than I could have, Silas rumbled. He leaned in close. You know, Mrs. Kincaid, I made a bad investment. Clara raised an eyebrow. Oh, I paid $1 for you. He teased, his eyes twinkling. And all you did was give away our real estate. Clara laughed, a sound that was pure joy. Best dollar you ever spent, old man. The best. He agreed, serious now. He kissed her in front of the whole town. The crowd cheered, throwing hats in the air. Later that evening, they rode back up the mountain. They didn't live in the town. They returned to the cabin near the timberline. It had been expanded now with more rooms and glass windows, but it was still their sanctuary. They sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley they had conquered. The gold mine was being worked by honest men, paid fair wages. The town was thriving. Clara rested her head on Silas's shoulder. The scars on his face were fading, softened by happiness. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked. "I was thinking about the rope," Clara said softly. "The rope my uncle tied me with." "Forget the rope," Silas said. "I have," she said. "I'm thinking about the dollar. I'm going to frame it." "Why?" "So I never forget," Clara said, looking at the man who had saved her soul. "That value isn't what people say you are worth. Value is who stands beside you when the world falls apart." Silas pulled her close, wrapping the old buffalo coat around both of them as the mountain air cooled. "You're home, Clara," he whispered. "I know," she said. "I'm home." And so the legend of Blackwood Creek was written not in ink, but in the enduring love between the beast and the outcast. They say if you go up to the Bitterroots today, you can still see the ruins of the old cabin, looking out over a valley that freedom built. Silas and Clara didn't just find gold. They found a treasure that no thief could steal, and no time could tarnish. They proved that even the most broken things can be mended with a little courage, a lot of fight, and a single silver dollar. What an incredible journey. From a $1 auction to the rulers of the valley. Silas and Clara's story proves that true worth comes from the spirit, not the pocketbook. If this story moved you, please smash that like button. It helps us bring more of these epic tales to life. Who was your favorite character? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you never miss a saga from the Wild West. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next trail.